Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. This is actually our last part of our series titled Systemic Racism, How Boards Can Positively Impact Their Companies in Boardrooms. This is the series summary, and it's the fourth part of a four-part series that is looking at three prominent U.S. segments of the population: Asian/Pacific, Latino/Hispanic, and Afro-American/Black, and how they have been overlooked in both senior management and the boardroom. So first, let me introduce my guest and my partner today, who will help me recap this series. Please welcome Ashley Marchand Orme, who is the Associate Director of the NACD's Content and Special Initiatives, and recently has led the NACD's NXT initiative, which addresses how boards can leverage board diversity and inclusion. Welcome, Ashley.
Thank you, TK. It's a pleasure to be here.
So after working with boards for almost 30 years, and obviously with the support of Diligent, this show, and also me personally, feels the obligation to do our best to keep this inclusion conversation going and not let us drift back into a state where there's no action that's taken. So the inclusion numbers for all people of color in senior management and the board is pretty sad. Hispanics alone account for 20% of the U.S. population, yet their board representation is only 3%. Now, if you followed my career, you know that I have never been accused of being a tree hugger or even an activist, but I'm happy, Ashley, to declare that it's time for corporate America to lead the way to a more diverse boardroom. So, Ashley, with these conversations about racial issues in senior management and the boardroom, they are never easy. But this is the reason for the series, and this is why it needs to happen. So let's get started with a recap. So my first question for you, Ashley, is after viewing the three earlier segments with the Asian, Hispanic, Latino, and African American Black, what were your takeaways and what comment or observations sort of made you think twice about what you saw or heard?
Well, I want to first of all say, after watching those episodes, I was blown away by a couple of things. One, just the wonderful ability of those guests to share personal stories, because I think that's what this comes down to, right? This is not something, these issues of racial injustice and lack of representation are not issues that just impact people somewhere else. This impacts people who are actually right now in the boardroom. So just thinking through the episode where you had a couple of representatives from the Asian American community, we heard some of the things that we know are issues, right? We've heard personal stories about feeling invisible, about the need for people to recognize Asian Americans for the great leadership abilities that they have in the boardroom, and the lack of representation that we see among Asian Americans in certain industries. I was specifically struck by a story Priya shared about being invisible, sitting on a panel talking about governance-related issues, only to then be approached by an individual who had been in the audience and hadn't even realized that she was part of the panel. So I think those stories are stories that we see resonating, beyond just a few stories here or there. These are bigger issues. These are trends that we really need to pay attention to. One of the themes that came up in that episode too was around the idea of sponsorship. So thinking through how individuals can come around the Asian American community and really support them, not just with words, but with actions. Thinking through how you are creating opportunities within your company for Asian Americans to actually thrive and move up in the ranks of leadership into the C-suite and eventually into the boardroom as well. Something that I thought was really interesting about your other episode, where you spoke about representation of the Hispanic community in the boardroom was the fact that we are facing these incredible demographic shifts in the United States. I think we're all aware of the fact that the Latino population in the United States is growing, and they are a huge, not only consumer base, employee base in the United States. They're voters of the future. They're taxpayers. They're people who are participating in our society, yet they lack representation in the boardroom. So there are a couple of things that really, really struck me in that conversation that you had, TK. One of them was, a comment by Roel even about how organizations sometimes look at Latino potential employees and have these biases that they carry around when they're talking to these individuals. I think Roel used the example even of some folks who are interested in getting employment and how sometimes if you're hiring individuals and you're even having a conversation with a Latino who may have even an accent, the biases that you might even have when you're approaching that conversation and thinking that person may be less intelligent, which is ironic, right? Because you're talking to an individual who speaks multiple languages. So I think there are a couple of things that really struck me about that. It's really about understanding the biases that we all bring to the table and how that actually impacts people who are at organizations who are trying to lead. So that I thought was interesting. And then your final episode with Rose and John Rogers, also interesting. I was encouraged too by the fact that you talked a little bit about some of the learnings that other communities can take from African Americans who've made a little bit more headway in the boardroom, just around sort of the ability of that community to really hold on to some of the progress that came after the civil rights movement and really catalyze change through that. So I think we're in a really special place right now where people are talking about these issues. This is good. I feel like we're at another one of those points where we can actually see some really strong momentum forward, probably not like we've seen since, the civil rights movement. So I'm hoping companies really take advantage of that opportunity, to your point, TK, that there is an important conversation happening right now. It's just a matter of seeing people back that up with action at this point.
Yeah, I love the reminder that John Rogers gave about the history of civil rights and how that has sort of, the other two communities don't have really that sort of lead in that the civil rights had. And I just thought he did a terrific job. And in fact, that was probably, Ashley, my biggest challenge, is to get the right people who I knew would be open, and candid to speak. And, I recognize, I'm not going to win any special awards as a host, but in this particular case, I felt so comfortable about the guests that I had, and they certainly performed when the spotlight came on. I thought they did a terrific job, and I just hope people get a chance to listen to their stories and sort of what their experiences were, because I think that's storytelling is always the best way to get a point across, and they all did a great job of that. I do want to get back to one of the comments you made. For me, it was interesting. I never realized in the sort of Hispanic community that their numbers were so low. I know they had a big section of our population in the U.S., as I said in the opening, 20%. But when I looked at it, I don't hear that voice very often. And I think my perception is that they have the biggest mountain to climb. Not that everybody doesn't have a mountain to climb, but I sort of sense that their voice was sort of the quietest in the group, and that might have to change for them, to make better headway. What's your take on that?
Yeah, well, and it's an interesting question, because my first thought is, wow, the Hispanic population in the United States is so diverse, right? And you layer on top of that things like gender. So looking at the board representation for Latina women is really low. You layer on top of that things like, the fact that there is an Afro-Latino community, so that further complicates things. But I think if you just pause and sort of take that wide angle view about why representation for the Latino community might be so low in the boardroom, there are a couple things that come to mind, for me. One is you think about how we get new people into the boardroom to begin with, right? And over the past several decades, what we've seen is when we measure the ways people are coming into the boardroom, it's often through social networks of existing board members. So if you were on a board and you have a seat opening up, one thing you're going to think about is, who do I know within my own social network who could potentially fill that slot? The challenge there is that we also know that our social networks are pretty segregated, especially if you are Caucasian American. There have been so many studies recently about the lack of diversity within the social networks of Caucasian Americans. So I think that has also challenged the situation. You can look at Hispanic communities, you can look at the Black community, their own social networks are far more integrated, so that they know folks from different backgrounds. And that's just not the case with the folks who are predominantly in boardrooms right now. So I think that's an issue we've got to pay attention to. Touching quickly on something, again, that Roel had mentioned in your episode, is that idea of the bias that we bring to the table, specifically when it comes to Latinos and their ability to lead in the boardroom and in the C-suite. We have to think critically about how we perceive other people and whether our perceptions are actually valid. And I think that's something that we're going to have to pay more and more attention to, so that we can really lead the way and make room for Latino representation within the boardroom.
So the crux of this series is really to suggest some actions that boards can take to positively improve the diversity of boards, and certainly the inclusion of the different races that we discussed. So when you reviewed these, what were the common themes in all three of the segments that you thought were worth sort of making sure that people didn't miss the point?
That's a great question. I think a couple of themes that really struck me were, number one, to continue the conversation. I think we're at a place where a lot of folks realize this is not a flash in the pan discussion, right? Because we have these broad demographic shifts in the United States, and because we're in the middle of this racial justice movement, there really is momentum. And I don't think that's going to go away, but that also means that people have to engage in meaningful ways. That means us being able to say, we're going to have these discussions, we're going to be able to talk about these issues openly and with clear communication, realizing that there is a goal, and the goal is to get further down the road, right? It's a matter of figuring out how do we get there. So the theme of continuing the conversation was really important. I think there were a couple of individuals in these last few episodes of your show that talked about the importance of understanding data. So tracking the data, measuring where your organization currently stands as far as not only diversity, but inclusion is really important. And then the other theme that struck me was that of taking ownership as a director, that this is, yes, a broad issue that society has to deal with, but that also means that on the individual level and at the boardroom level, we have to discuss these things. We have to figure out what our individual actions are to move forward. We have to figure out what we need to do as a board to move forward. And it's going to be hard work. It's not easy. We didn't land here overnight. This has taken, decades, hundreds of years to get to this point. So the work is not going away overnight. That it means engaging and being willing to sort of roll up your sleeves to get the work done, to see progress.
Well, those are great points, and ones that I think on my list are on as well. The only thing I will add, it's always a lesson for me. I think it's always a lesson for everybody, because I don't think anybody really has mastered this, and that's the art of listening. Having the opportunity to make sure that you're focused on listening what the other person is saying. And my hope is that sometimes occasional distractions, like, where the looting happened and whatever, doesn't take people away from listening to the meaningful message that was started there. Okay, and so I don't think listening. This request for listening is not new. This has been going on for some time, and not just in boardroom issues, but in a lot of important issues. People are much better talkers than they are listeners. And so that's a big issue as well. You guys at the NACD certainly spend a lot of time on education and that. What programs or events or what things do you have that would act equally as resources to help boards in their quest to enhance inclusion and diversity?
So it's funny. I want to lead into this question by sort of pulling in a note from your comment on our last question, which is that point of listening. And one of the important things when we consider what it means to listen in this environment is to understand the complexity of the issue. I think it's human nature. We always want to simplify things and be able to put things in buckets of, this is, X and this is Y, but understanding there's complexity in the issue. So at NACD, we're trying to address the complexity in a couple of different ways. One of the resources that we have is something that touches on, an issue we haven't talked a ton about right now, but it's that issue of board turnover, because that is part of this whole, environment around board diversity and the lack of diversity on board. So one resource we created fairly recently was a guide around offboarding. We talk about onboarding new directors a lot, but we don't talk about what it's like to actually allow directors to get off of a board. So we created a resource called The Healthy Departure: Considerations for Effective Offboarding. And that, I think, is something that boards have struggled with. We know that that's an issue that boards have struggled with for some time. So trying to put some parameters that are healthy around that process, so you can know when it's time for someone to step off the board, here's the way to do it. And that's how you can help make room for more individuals to come on with more diverse experience and backgrounds. So in addition to that resource, we have an entire resource center on board diversity. One of the things we added to that resource center recently was basically a research brief on board oversight of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how to combat racism. So how you as a board look internally within your organization and think through the ways that your company and that maybe your industry have contributed to some of the problems out there. One other resource I do want to point to is a report that we published a few years ago. It's a Blue Ribbon Commission report on diversity. And we brought together several really interesting and intelligent thought leaders around diversity and inclusion to help us think through what boards should actually do moving forward and go beyond just thinking through compliance and what you have to do to try to avoid lawsuits, but how you actually activate the power of diversity and inclusion in your companies so you can actually help move toward greater long-term value creation. So those are just a few, but we have a wide range of resources and tools and templates that boards can access through our Diversity Resource Center on our website.
Well, I think I certainly would recommend those. I will also say that Diligent has formed a database to help find diverse candidates, and all of the sponsors on this show have created unique sections of their website, PwC and the others. So I recommend those as well. I don't think there can be too many resources in this space. So I hope people certainly take advantage of that. So we get the benefit, Ashley, of making closing comments about the series. So I'll let you start, and then if it's okay, I'll close. And again, I can't thank our guests enough who have, I think they've made the series. But what would be your last communique or observation that you'd want to pass along to our audience?
Sure. Thank you, TK. And I do want to echo too, your guests have been phenomenal. It's always good to hear authentic personal stories from people in the boardroom. my closing thoughts would be just this. I've heard a lot of directors still asking, how do we learn more? And people are still at the stage of wanting to learn. They want to do, but they want to take action in an informed way. One suggestion I would have is to pause and consider what you were learning when you first go into the boardroom, right? So we created an onboarding guide a few years back at NACD that helped directors think through the operating environment, the company itself, what you learn about the company, what you learn about the boardroom, and then your individual responsibilities as a director. I would say to individuals, we know we're at a special moment in history. We know that the eye is turned toward racial justice and diversity and inclusion right now. So if individuals are trying to learn what they can do about these issues, learn these issues a little bit more in depth, I would say to pause, make sure you understand what's going on in the operating environment. Make sure you understand how your company has contributed to some of these issues in positive and negative ways in the past. Look inside the boardroom. Think about how your own board composition has maybe contributed to some of these issues. And then look at yourself individually as a director. That's really where the hard work comes in, is addressing your own biases and being open to positive feedback about how change can happen internally. So, there's a difficult road ahead. I don't think it's something that we can't overcome. Obviously, we continue to make progress. It's just a matter of being committed to the work. And for the board, it's a matter of holding even management to be committed moving forward. So those are my couple of thoughts. But I think, again, you've had wonderful directors on your show. I'm glad to be part of it. So TK, thank you for inviting me.
Well, my closing comment will be centered around tolerance and understanding, because I think if you look at the bell curve, there's no question that there's directors today that, because of multitude of reasons, have biases or are certainly racist in nature at the one end of the bell curve. The other end, there's a bunch of people that get it. They've always gotten it. They're making headway. They're doing that. But the largest section of people in the middle of the bell curve are people that are learning, learning in this. And I know in talking to people, there's questions that they want to ask, but they have this great fear that the ignorance of their questions are going to seem racist. And so subsequently, they don't start the conversation that they should, And then we fall down because nobody's listening and nobody's speaking about the issues. I would ask both sides of this to be, those people in the middle, to be understanding and tolerant as we try and get the fence sitters over on the side of helping us lead through this process. They are still learning about their biases. Sometimes they don't realize their bias. And in other cases, they're trying to change. Their eyes has been opened, but again, they're afraid to bring the topic up and say something wrong and be viewed in a negative way. So I would hope that as we move forward, people are listening better, they're more tolerant, they're more understanding of that. And Ashley, I think in that environment, we can make continued progress. And I want to thank you. I thought you summarized and did a wonderful recap of the series. And I appreciate you taking the time for joining us.
Thank you, TK. It's been a pleasure.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.